Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 22nd meeting of 2025 of the Economy and the Fair Work Committee. We have apologies this morning from Gordon MacDonald and from Lorna Slater. Our first item of business is a decision to take item 3, consideration of evidence in private. Are members content to take this item in private? Okay, thank you very much. Our next item of business is with the management of bus manufacturer Alexander Dennis. On the 11th of June, Alexander Dennis announced a consultation which considers consolidating its UK bus body manufacturing operations into a single site in Scarborough. That would mean the closure of the site at Falkirk and the suspension of work at Lambert on completion of current orders. This would potentially put 400 jobs at risk. The committee heard from trade union representatives yesterday, and today I welcome Paul Davis, President and Managing Director, and Debbie McCreath, External Affairs and Marketing Director for Alexander Dennis. As always, I appeal to members and witnesses to keep questions and answers as concise as possible. And thank you to the panel for joining us. Can I start by asking, I suppose, what specifically would it take to keep production in Scotland? I mean, how many orders are we talking about that you would require in order to keep your production going in Scotland? Is it about a pipeline of business? Is it about a specific number of orders? What exactly is required?
The capacity of the site in Scotland is about 300 to 400 buses a year, and the question has been asked of us by the government: what would it take to postpone the consultation and stop the process from being carried through? And one issue obviously is demand and orders for new buses. So we've given that indication of what the annual requirement would be. Clearly, from a 2025 standpoint, that is a slightly lower number. There are
what is that number?
So 70 to 100 buses this year. But from our perspective, there's sort of wider issues, and obviously there's been a conversation around a potential furlough scheme. But that for us is really part of a wider issue around sort of ongoing demand and the issue of reform and the Subsidy Control Act conversations that have been around for some time.
Yeah, but the Subsidy Control Act, obviously, that covers the whole of the UK and Scarborough included. I'm just trying to get very specifically what you would require in the next few months in order to effectively call off the closure of Falkirk. I mean, so you're talking about 70 to 100 orders this year, what, 300 orders next year? Yes. I mean, and how far away from that are you at the moment in terms of...
We don't have sufficient volume in our order book to sustain 2 manufacturing sites in the UK, so that's why we are looking at the consolidation activity. Okay,
so how many more would you need next year in order to be able to run both sites?
In the region of 300 to 400.
300 to 400, and you don't. And how many do you have for next year, sort of roughly?
Very few.
Very few at the moment. Okay. So quite specifically though, if you were able to secure those orders, which is we say about between 70 and 100 this year, and 300 orders next year, if you were able to secure those orders, would you absolutely give a guarantee that that production would take place in Scotland and you wouldn't just simply transfer that to Scarborough anyway?
So then I would speak to the further points on how we bridge the gap between the gap in our order book that's coming in the summer to us being able to build bodies in Scotland and say in Q3 in the autumn. Hence the conversation around how do we bridge that gap to the point where we have no work in the summer for any new work coming in. And so, as I say, that was the conversation around a potential furlough scheme. But we are then saying, OK, well, what's beyond that? So, the market dynamics are significantly changed, and without that sort of runway and a feeling that something will change in the future, then our sort of thought process or our decision-making process around consolidating manufacturing is premised on a market size and a potential market share, assuming nothing else changes. So that brings us back to the conversation around, well, is the landscape going to change? The conversations around local content and social benefits and things like that. So it's a broader conversation rather than just saying an order will stop the consultation process.
And we will come to those very specific issues around the landscape in a second, but it is a case of those conversations are not going to come up with a solution in the next couple of weeks. But you may have a situation where you could be able to secure orders, and you're talking about between 70 and 100 for this year, and potentially 300 for next year. You could be in that particular position, potentially with a furlough scheme. in order to overcome that. But what I'm trying to I suppose, is to get from you is whether or not that would actually make a tangible difference. Would you give an absolute commitment that if you were able to secure that number that we've talked about, and then those other conversations can continue in the months ahead, that you'll continue production in Falkirk and Lambert in the short term as those discussions take place?
As I say, there are wider implications for us. We have, over the last few years, endeavoured and spent a lot of money to retain skills and capacity in Scotland by paying non-productive time, for example, because the market was very difficult through the pandemic. It's sort of come back, registrations are back to normal, but our market share within that registration or in the market have dropped. And therefore, for us to be financially stable and financially viable, consolidating into one site is right now the solution that we see to getting us through that sort of financial situation.
But it does seem to be, you do seem to be suggesting, though, even if you got extra orders, you would consolidate anyway. So our message to government has been it's got to be part of a sort of bigger picture around some of these other issues that we've been contending with, because it would potentially just delay a process rather than stop it. But it would allow those conversations to continue, because with the best will in the world, changes around some of those things may take a bit of time. That's not going to happen in 45 days. I mean, you're having a consultation at the start of the summer holidays when your workers are going off on holiday, and you're having a 45-day consultation. With the best will in the world, you're not going to get those answers in the 45 days. It's about making sure that there's an opportunity to have those discussions going forward. So I'm just trying to really get, I suppose, what would it take to stop the consultation, to allow those wider discussions to actually take place? Because there is a feeling that it's a done deal. It's not actually a consultation. It's just you don't seem to be able to say, if we get 300 orders next year, 70 this year, we'll hold things as we have those conversations. It's absolutely not a done deal. It's a consultation process. We're very grateful for the active engagement we've had from both governments and from other political parties and stakeholders, and we're absolutely committed to keeping those conversations going, along with this committee too. But it's, there are for us other implications around the long term, the runway. Is the market dynamics going to change? Because our assumptions are, if they don't change, then we have to take action to look after the company in the right way. But yet, I could come back to the point, though, that a lot of those changes are not going to happen in 45 days, though. It may very well be that a commitment to have those wider discussions in the longer term, the next few months, is that enough, along with specific orders, to keep production going in Falkirk and Lambert?
If I could just add on the points Paul's been making. So in terms of our ask to government at this time, it has been around the short-term solution. We've split them into short-term and I guess more medium to long-term. So in the short term, these are the asks that we've got that are within the consultation period, and it is just a legal minimum of 45 days, so we're not set on it just being 45 at this time. And we know the trade unions have asked for a possibility to extend the consultation. We're actively reviewing that right now. But in terms of the short-term asks, it is that two-pronged approach of, can we look at a furlough scheme to bridge to where these orders would come through? And while there is, there's opportunities potentially for 25 and 26, we would need to see both of them, at least a solid signal come through that is something that would be possible, because if there's only a solution found to the 2025 demand issue, it essentially pushes our cliff edge to the end of 2025 and doesn't solve for 2026. But on the conversations you're referring to around, the likes of subsidy control, they are our more, I guess, medium to long-term things. We've asked for a signal that maybe something will change. It's really around local content rules and requirements. There's a small thing within the industrial strategy from the UK government that says, we'll consider using public procurement to strengthen domestic supply chains. But for us, we're kind of hoping to have a bit more of a commitment on what that could look like. But we are, our expectations are absolutely managed in that this level of change will not happen within the 45-day window, but we are really keen to progress them as far as we can.
Okay, so that's super clear. But you still require a minimum number of orders, though, and it is that figure that you're saying, extra 70 for the rest of this year, 300 for the following year, and that would allow you absolutely to continue production in Scotland, knowing that those further conversations are happening.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, can I bring in, Deputy Convener's got a supplementary on that issue.
So just a couple of wee points. One, to me, you're talking about even if you could reach this magical number in terms of orders, getting them sold, the order fulfilment, and sustained demand for that same level to make your profit margins work. Am I correct in that? It's about sustained demand.
Yes.
Okay. And I just wanted to check, I mean, given, looking at the numbers in the business and what we've seen, sort of financial flows over the past few years, going back well before COVID, it appears to me that there was a trigger for this action being taken just now. Because, yeah, okay, we could see the pattern in terms of profit margin, but there was a trigger. Can I ask what that trigger was?
So if you look at the historical UK market registrations, so somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 buses per annum, and back with low emission vehicles only, the competitive landscape was much different. Through the pandemic, registrations went as low as 1,100 buses. To give you some context for that, in 2024 we delivered 1,400 buses to the market. We have an annual capacity between our factories of 1,600 buses. In 2025, and we expected 2025 to be a difficult year because of the way that funding rounds for zero emission buses had played out. So we knew 2025 was going to be a tougher year than 2024. But I would say things have got more difficult through 2025, and just to look at that sort of financially viable, sustainable business. And assuming if the market stays at around 3,000 buses, let's say demand continues to be healthy because of commitments to decarbonisation, to companies saying of a zero emission fleet by 2030, 2035, whatever it may be. If our regular market demand is smaller now, if it's now 30-something% and not historically as it was 50 or 60%, then we can't afford to sustain two factories. So it just comes back to the size of the business, our ability to do that in one factory rather than two, and for us to be able to as I say, be financially viable.
And again, what you've articulated is the position, going back a number of years, and we can see that. But what my question was, or rather, I'll put it to you, it looks to me like the trigger has been some kind of refinancing from either yourselves or the parent company. That's often typically when a forensic accountant looks under the covers, looks at the historical data and says, wait a minute, something needs to be done here. Has that been the trigger?
No. Okay. The decision or the proposal that we've made is entirely led by myself and the executive team in the UK. Yes, it goes through our parent company, NFI Group, and I should say we're very lucky to have NFI Group as a parent company. They've been hugely supportive to this business since they acquired the company in 2019. The proposal we're making is a proposal that has been led by myself and the executive team in the UK, but obviously been through the NFI executive and board approval process. But it has nothing to do with NFI Group or their refinancing or their financial situation, none whatsoever.
Okay, thank you.
No, supplementary.
Just following on with the questions we've been talking about there. Can I ask, when you don't produce, you only produce buses to order. So that, or sorry, the majority. I mean, this is what.
Yeah, we do have different segments. We have a retail sector where we do build buses for stock.
Right.
We do have some. But it's a small part of the business, maybe a third of the business.
But what you're looking for essentially is orders. So when you're normally discussing orders with customers, how long does that process take from start of discussions, identification obviously from customers what they need, discussions, agreeing price, etc., to confirmation?
It can vary. I would say 6 months to a year, just depending on which sector. Which is, it could be London, it could be the large groups, could be provincial customers, major independents, but it can be anything from 6 months to a year.
Okay, so feasibility-wise, you could still be having these conversations for next year, but anything ahead of that would need to be essentially an expedited process, and that to some extent would require a company firstly to be identified. I mean, from your experiences, I suppose, so far and the like, how many companies or customers do you have that can work on a kind of expedited process without large incentives from government or other sources?
It's a good question. I think when you look at the zero emission landscape, typically most of those buses have been funded in some way through, SULEB, ScotZeb, or a Zebra scheme, so they tend to be a little bit more complex. We do have a challenge in the market at the moment where we are transitioning from low emission to zero emission. And that, our observation of the market has been that it does create a bit of a vacuum because, whilst the potential for government funding is available, then operators would be more inclined to wait to see how that funding falls through. And then another challenge we have in the UK is obviously the advent of franchising, and started in Manchester, rolling to Liverpool and going beyond. But if you're an operator who is in that region that's going through a franchising process, you're very unlikely to be investing massively in capital and new fleet, because you're going to have to tender effectively for those routes and those services. So, there are not many opportunities to sort of pivot quickly.
Okay, thanks. I'll maybe come back to that and other questions later. Thanks, Convener.
Can I bring in Murdo Fraser?
Thank you. Good morning to you both. Thanks for coming along. I want to interrogate the issue of the choice to consolidate at Scarborough as opposed to in Falkirk. And I'd be grateful if you just explain to me the thinking behind that. What were the reasons why Scarborough was chosen and not Scotland?
Sure. The Scarborough is a much larger site. It has more capacity. We have more team members there. It's also capable of building all of our product range, both single deck low emission, single deck zero emission, and same for double deck. We also have a long-term lease commitment in Scarborough. We own our facilities in Scotland. We lease the facility in Scarborough. So in terms of being able to consolidate into Scotland, it would not be possible given the size and shape of the facilities and the number of team members we have. But Scarborough, as I say, can address that.
Okay. And is there any difference in terms of either productivity or efficiency of the two different sites?
No, I wouldn't say there's much difference. Okay.
When we had the unions in yesterday, one of the issues we explored in that context was the fact that workers in Scotland are apparently paid a higher rate than workers in Scarborough. Was that a factor in the business's consideration?
It's true there's a £1.11 difference per hour between the two, but as I say, the issue for us is that the site consolidation is not possible in Scotland, whereas I say, as explained, Scarborough can address that. So,
okay. And finally, for me, is there any difference in the support or potential support available from, for example, public agencies such as enterprise agencies in the two different sites?
No. We don't have any support or commitment of support from the UK government or any of the regions in terms of local councils. We obviously have fantastic support here in Scotland from Scottish Enterprise, which we're very grateful for, but that's not a factor in this decision either. Okay, thank you.
What the level of that support is, and was there any conditionality attached to that support?
Well, yes. So we have for many years had R&D grant funding from Scottish Enterprise, which the way it works is it's around new product development. And clearly, at the moment in this transition to zero emissions, we have in the last few years been on a sort of big project to bring our integral zero-emission buses to market. So Scottish Enterprise grant funding has been available for that. There is a condition around jobs in Scotland, which we recognise and respect. So the size of that, and the current grant is around about, I think, 13 million from Scottish Enterprise. But on the other side of that, there's 30 million of our own money that we're investing in terms of, as I say, engineering and bringing those products to market.
The grant funding itself, it is, whenever we've been a recipient from Scottish Enterprise, it is, as Paul says, it's been made up of, it's typically about 30% roughly of Scottish Enterprise support to 70% company investment. And in terms of where the funding has gone, it's around new products and bringing new technologies to market, so things that are engineered and built in Scotland. So all of our next generation products that we've brought for not just the UK market, but also technologies we've engineered here and exported around the world have been supported through the grant. I know there was some comments yesterday at the committee around the union not being clear where the grant funding had gone. It is a research and development grant. And it does have that jobs commitment that Paul mentions. So we are tied in contractually to 520 people under the current grant within Scotland. And we are aware of the fact that obviously if we were to leave Scotland, that would be a key part that we would renege on. But I would probably quite like to draw the committee's attention to the fact that Scottish Enterprise do put that condition on the grant, and it's something that we've seen as it's something that we would like to see in other parts of potentially grant funding, which is tying in public monies given to jobs and investment in the local area.
This doesn't seem to have secured the jobs though, but what is the value of that grant?
The value of the current grant is 13.2 million. We've drawn down 11.2 million in the current period. In terms of company investment, we have contributed 40.5 million to a total project of 53.7 million. And in the previous grant from 2019 to 2022, Scottish Enterprise contributed 10 million, Alexander Dennis contributed 18.9 million to a total of 28.9 million pounds. Okay,
so that's a total. And over what period is that specific fund?
So the first one, so the one that is 13.2 million is from 2022 to currently. It's due to run to the end of the year. And the one previously was from 2019 to 2022.
Okay, good. Thanks very much. Could I bring in Willie Coffey?
David, thanks for coming to talk to us here. We spoke to union colleagues yesterday, as you know, and I asked them if they had been given any access or sight of the company's case for Scarborough that Murdo was leading on there, the business case for Scarborough, so that they could have an opportunity, and perhaps the governments as well, to scrutinise that and to understand your thinking. But all they could say to us is that they hadn't been given that. It was just an orders issue. It's an orders issue. Robert, I think it was repeated that several times. In your answer a moment ago, you were saying Scarborough is bigger, it can do everything there, Falkirk can't. So the question arises initially, with all that Scottish Enterprise money you've had over the years, why haven't you made Falkirk as competitive as Scarborough in terms of production?
Okay, a couple of points there. The business case, if you like, is stepped through the consultation process. So I'm slightly surprised to hear the union members say that, because it's a fundamental part of any consultation process is the explanation of the business case, and we have done that.
Is that a document, though, Paul, or is it just an explanation?
Yeah, we do have a documented business case.
Can we see it, for example? Is that too confident?
No problem. To your point on Scarborough and Larbert, and probably speaking to the earlier question from the deputy convener, Larbert has had significant investment. We spent last year the best part of £8 million transforming Larbert into a first-class manufacturing facility for zero-emission buses. We didn't do that with the foresight to think that we'd be in this position in 2025. So, I guess it speaks to the earlier question around, is there some other sort of event that's driving this? We would never have made that investment to make Larbert, what it is, had we expected this situation to have unfolded.
Okay. So, in that sense, can Larbert actually compete with Scarborough?
Yes. It's not as the earlier question from Murdo. It's not about sort of the sort of competitiveness piece. It's the physical size and shape and the ability to deliver a full product range out of Scarborough. Larbert doesn't have that capability.
You don't have the orders to fulfil that, to fill up that space and capacity. You don't have the orders.
Yeah,
but you're still closing Larbert and Falkirk.
Yes.
I understand that.
As I say, just to add a little bit more on Larbert. So Larbert is designed to build double-deck products only. So that's it's a brand new modern production line. We've gone from like 9 traditional stages through to 18. And the idea was it was always going to be the home of the double-deck bus. However, because Larbert can only build double-deck, Scarborough has that capacity to double-deck. It also has, we made a decision last year or the year before to create a single-deck extension to the Scarborough site, and this was supposed to be in tandem with the Larbert site, but unfortunately, because of the situation we find ourselves in, we're having to now consider consolidation. So that the ability that Larbert has, Scarborough can do the same. But Larbert isn't also a complete factory in itself, so it is a production line, but it doesn't have like a paint shop, for example, on the site at this time. So it is a modern facility, but it just doesn't have the complete finishing that we would require for the full factory to work in itself.
I mean, it would be really hard for the workers to hear that because it doesn't have a paint shop that's been closed down and they're losing their jobs, wouldn't it? That's a bit much to...
Well, it's not that it just doesn't have a paint shop, it's just that it's not a fully functioning production line from start to end as the Scarborough facility is. Scarborough has the ability to do all products and can do beginning to end, from beginning of production to finishing. And that's... It's not, I would like to clarify, it's not because Larbert doesn't have a paint shop that we made that decision.
Looking ahead, is there a chance to allow both governments, perhaps, the unions and workers, to put together a proposal, a business case proposal of any shape, size or colour for you to genuinely consider? And I say that to you in all honesty, Paul. I remember the Diageo situation in Kilmarnock, where I was exactly in this position. And local people there were working furiously at both governments to try and put a business case together, to perhaps present to you a case that you have possibly not considered. We're in a net zero journey. There's huge demand for buses, and there's going to be, we anticipate, we hope. It doesn't seem to make any sense to us that this decision would be taken now in this particular climate. So is there a chance that if people do put the work in to try and put some kind of business case to you, you'll give them the opportunity to make that case?
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is not an easy decision for us. I've worked for Alexander Dennis for 27 years, right? And it's not an easy decision. And we, as I said earlier on, we're absolutely committed to those conversations. And the activity that's taken place in recent times is testament, I think, to the desire and commitment to do something. I would repeat, though, that this conversation for us is not a new one in terms of how our market's changed. And to be in the UK and to be competitive in the UK when there's no consideration given to our cost structure, our energy costs, our bill of material costs and different things like that, it becomes a very difficult proposition. So, and that's why I continue to repeat to the convener in the opening question, part of a longer term sort of change, we believe something structurally has to change, because otherwise, in a very fiercely competitive environment, our position is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But absolutely committed to doing that. Yeah.
If I could add that argument around, net zero transition, decarbonisation is something that we have been really vocal for in terms of advocacy for quite a long time, to say there's a great opportunity in the UK if we can find a way to recognise the UK so we can be competitive against those that are maybe not dealing with the same, as we would say, ingredients in terms of our manufacturing process and costs. So it is something that we have said, can we capitalise on this? But unfortunately, we are now out of runway, and that's why we've had to make the decision to go to consultation.
Okay. Thank you for giving that commitment, Paul. Thank you very much, Convener.
And Daniel Johnson.
Thank you. Look, can I, first of all, also thank you for coming in this morning, and let me be clear, what we would like is more buses to be built, more of them to be built in the UK. We need more for you to build more and build them in Scotland. So the questions may sound critical, but they're really about clarifying how we can build that situation. Can I start by you said that your capacity in Scotland is 300 to 400? So does that imply that the capacity in Scarborough is 1,200? 1,200. And you mentioned there, you painted a picture of kind of investment in Scarborough that has gone on, and indeed Larbert. Can you just specify when those key decisions were made, just a timeline, and has that implied that you've been building capacity for some time in Scarborough, and has that?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I would say that the investment in Scotland dwarfs the investment in Scarborough. We don't own the Scarborough site. We made an extension to our single deck production line. We made some changes to the double deck production line, and we took a kitting facility on to effectively make Scarborough more efficient, because it was sort of struggling with logistics. So those were very minor investments. I'm going to say in the order of £1.2 million, something like that. The Larbert investment has been way more significant, as I said, £8 million last year to get Larbert set up to build zero emission double deck. And again, we wouldn't have done that had we sort of got ourselves to this point in 2025. We just wouldn't have wasted the money had there been some sort of foresight around it. So we fully intended, as Debbie said, to run both sites, to have Larbour as our sort of world-class double-deck zero-emission bus site, and Scarborough being able to still supply low-emission buses, but also have the capability to build zero-emission buses as well. That was our.
So you've been investing more in Larbert, but now you're choosing to go to Scarborough. So can you just explain to me why that investment in Scarborough, which you said is a small investment, so it could produce single deck, couldn't have been made in Larbert or indeed Falkirk?
It was back to the sort of, I guess, the size and shape of Larbert versus the size and shape of Scarborough. Scarborough's a much bigger, much more versatile facility. There's more space to expand. Larbert is, just the simple geography doesn't support that.
I mean, is the ownership part of that? I mean, if you are under pressures, is this about asset liquidation and freeing up capital for your balance sheet?
No.
And I'm just simply asking the business question.
No.
Okay. Look, you mentioned there about the size and shape of the market, and I can understand that that's the fundamental. And we've got figures that have been supplied to us. I think they are possibly slightly different to the figures you're referencing there. But it looks as though, very approximately, in the years up to 2019, you were producing, according to DVLA, around 1,200 buses with a variation of just under 1,200 to peak. So the year was 2016 of 1,493. Is that right?
Within a margin of error, yes.
And that, according to the figures I've got, and this is just based on DVLA registrations, that's between a sort of 13-14% market share in that period of time. Is that?
Well, that wouldn't be bus. That sounds like it's a broader automotive share that's being
So what
referenced
market share do you think that?
In bus, that would be 55%.
55%. But then, essentially, in the last couple of years, obviously, pandemic, but 2024 was 976. Is that?
2024 was 1,278, but there'll be some time
just lag. Yeah. But that represents a drop in market share, does it?
Yes, it does. So that would be, if I go back to 2016, the statistic you referenced, it's 57% versus 45% in 2024. So
what's driven that? I mean, we understand that the interruption, everyone faced that, but what was different in the new post-pandemic world, which meant that you dropped 10% market share?
So in 2016, they would all have been low-emission buses, and again with a much different competitive landscape. In 2024, they're a mixture of low-emission and zero-emission buses with a much different competitive landscape.
So is that just that there are competitors that have sort of better expertise and experience with battery and electric motor technology, or are there other factors that allow them to compete? If you could just sort of pull that apart a little bit.
Yes, some of that, I would say. As I explained, we have been on a big investment journey in the last few years, back to the summary of the R&D grant funding, to bring a whole new range of zero-emission buses to market, and only this year are we going to have a zero-emission single-decker of our own coming to the market. So, yes, there is no doubt that the international competition has had a massive head start, coming off the back of a very well thought through state industrial strategy, as we know. We see it in other sectors beyond just bus. There are a number of factors, I would say, that are driving that market share change.
And could you just zero in a little bit? So you were mentioning there the sort of state industrial strategy that exists in other countries, and presumably we're talking principally China and Egypt, China. What does that look like? What is it that they have provided, and what advantages that afforded your Chinese competitors that you have not benefited from?
So I would probably zero in on time and cost. So some of the Chinese buses that are being supplied to the market today have been through a very sort of long maturing development cycle. Probably brought to market in 2012. first zero-emission buses in the UK in 2017, so already quite a large head start. So there's no doubt there's a product maturity element in there. The buses are reliable, they're of good quality, and they're well respected in the market. So I think that sort of product development timeline and that head start that they've had over the rest of the world, not just the UK but elsewhere. The second thing would be clearly battery supply chain, for example. So I spent, before I came back to the UK, 20 years of my career in Hong Kong, so we had relationships in China from a manufacturing standpoint, and we know from those conversations that we are paying probably twice as much per kilowatt hour for things like batteries. So I think there are some fundamentals. I mean, there are obviously clearly other supply chain dynamics around labour cost, around we pay 4 times China on energy, and so
look, I mean, I think we understand the labour costs. I mean, let's not get into the kind of all the dynamics of electricity and energy costs. What I'm interested in is what sort of direct state benefit and support have those competitors, and I mean, how much of that is a contributory factor to the headwinds that you're facing in terms of market share?
I wouldn't have the specifics of that, to be honest. I mean, we probably could point you towards the European Commission investigation into some of that around that sort of pointed towards tariffs on cars, for example, because it's some of the same companies that are involved in that sector. I mean, we can't answer the specifics here, though. I don't have that.
Okay. So, I mean, you mentioned the Subsidy Control Act. Now, I mean, my understanding, based on some of the correspondence that I've seen, the Subsidy Control Act, as it stands right now, first of all, allows social value to be considered as part of a bid, allows direct award, and it also allows differential treatment for non-treaty countries, which China is in that category. I just wonder what your understanding of both what can be done now under the Subsidy Control Act, and you were alluding to you were looking for further changes. I'd just be interested in what you think those things should be.
So the challenge we found with the Subsidy Control Act is, and you're correct in the assumptions you've shared just there in terms of what the Act can do. The challenge we find in the bus world is because the principles are applied to grants and subsidies. So when we talk about government funding rounds, they are subsidies or grants given to stimulate demand in the market. And it's within that the clause falls in to say you can't actively say we want to have a local, you can't have like a domestic versus importer in terms of preference. You can't specify that within the grant. And it's something we've raised, I think with every funding round that's come from whether it's Scotland or the UK to say, can we look at local content? Can you consider putting that, as a condition of the grant? And every time we've raised that concern, the advice has always come back to say we can't do it. The subsidy control rules and the Act itself binds us, and we're not allowed to do it. So when it was to go to the Competition and Markets Authority for approval, it would say it doesn't meet subsidy control rules. The direct award piece, we understand that to be correct, along with the treaty comment as well. But the challenge is that when competitive tenders are run with subsidy, it becomes quite challenging to impose those rules. Social value, I think, is something that we're really encouraged by, particularly in the new Procurement Act for the UK, for England, in that we're hopeful that will make some changes. But the challenge has often come to us around social value, which is how do you define social value? Because one person's social value could be different to someone else's. So we've been doing a little bit of work through the English initiative called the UK Bus Manufacturing Expert Panel to see what is social value. Because for some tenders that we see, it could be donate to a charity. In others, it could be tell us about your environmental and social governance work. So we're hopeful that social values could maybe move into the jobs and economic growth piece, but the subsidy control issue for us comes into when there is grant funding involved, which for the majority of zero-emission bus purchases in the UK for the past few years, that's always the blocker that comes up to say we can't tell the local authority or indeed another entity to say we want you to buy British. That's always been the advice that we've been given back.
And can I just a couple of last questions. So you've obviously benefited to a degree from the Scottish Government's rounds of zero emissions. So I'm flicking between tables in my document here. So the ScotZEB, there's been some ambiguity as to precisely the number of buses that you've ended up being able to supply through that. Could you just clarify how many buses in ScotZEB round 1 and round 2 were ordered from Alexander Dennis?
Yes, so in ScotSeb 1 there was 110 orders that were funded through the ScotSeb 1 programme that came to Alexander Dennis, and in ScotSeb 2 we have 44 orders that came to
44.
Alexander Dennis. I'd be happy to provide the committee with our data on the orders themselves, and again we can go back to the SULEBs 1 and 2 as well to say, like, so you can essentially have the exact specifics of what
44 was my understanding of the number for the
yes,
second round.
that's what we have,
Yeah.
and again happy to share that with the committee in
Can I
terms of the data.
just ask one last question, and it's quite an important one. So you set out in terms of that you've had quite a substantial amount of funding in recent years from Scottish Enterprise. I mean, it's actually higher than the numbers that we had here. But and over the years, tens of millions of pounds, and including, I mean, according to my numbers here, over £7 million just in the last 3 years. But it sounds like there's more than that has been made available. At any point through that, did you discuss with them your commitment to Scotland, or the fact that these options were on the table? Because I can't believe it's just in the last 6 months that the thought that you might consolidate in Scarborough occurred.
Can I take the second before you go take the first part of the question? As, you know, the review, the business review of what we need to do to protect the business in its entirety to be financially viable, that conversation took place in February, and I would point to the previous actions around investment in Scotland that you know, had this been some sort of, you know, predetermined plan or plan from previous, we wouldn't have made the investment in Scotland in this facilities like we did last year. So it was February this year, as I said earlier on, you know, we knew that, you know, having delivered 1,400 buses in 2024, that 2025 was going to be a tougher year. But it has got you know, tougher than we expected, and therefore the business review that we've undertaken took place in February this year.
I mean, forgive me, I mean, having been in business, and businesses of different sizes, that may well be the point at which you've started formally assessing that plan. I can't believe that's the first time the business, you know, considered that scenario. What was the first point that, you know, formally as a you know, company executive, you set out plant consolidation as an option that existed for you as a business?
So the answer is February. I would sort of point you toward to the.
So you never discussed that in any board meetings or management meetings about the possibilities before February this year.
Correct. So and let me explain why that is. And if you go back to the registration data that you referred to earlier on, and you look at the number of buses that Alexander Dennis supplied through the pandemic years. So, roughly 2016 was 1,500. It got as low in 2021 as 604. So why is that an important figure? Because, and I spoke earlier on about being very lucky to be part of NFI Group. Over those years, the company has invested significant amount of money, eight figures of money, in what we call non-productive time, to retain skills and capacity, waiting for the better days to come. So by that I mean, when market returns, we have done everything we can not to lose the skills and experience that underpin our business. So, but the reality is, in better times, which you could argue 2024 were better times, our volume was 1,278. But more importantly, from a zero emissions standpoint, the market share growth of the foreign competition now has only emerged in the last sort of 12 months or so. That is now a reality for us, and that is why February 2025 and us considering what we need to do to be financially viable was the trigger.
I guess what I find slightly difficult is, I totally accept that it might not have been planned, and I totally accept what you're saying now, that you wanted the plant to grow, and that's why you put in the investment. I just slightly find it hard to believe that February was the first point that you did even a sort of a speculative examination. In a business, especially business the size of yours, you scenario plan, you look at kind of the optimistic, expected and pessimistic scenarios. I'm just wondering at what point in the last few years was the first time that kind of a plant consolidation appeared, even if it was a kind of a distant, pessimistic scenario. You never...
No.
Okay.
So our annual operating plan for 2025 originally had 1,400 plus buses in it. The most likely outcome this year is going to be somewhere between 900 and 1,000.
Okay.
And to my point, we would never have gone to our board for approval for £8 million of capital investment in the Larbert facility had we had that as a thought.
And accessing any of the Scottish Enterprise money, did that happen? Has any of that happened after that February decision, or is that the February decision to look at plant consolidation, the application to access the Scottish Enterprise funding? That was all prior to that, or did any of that happen subsequent to the decision in February?
The application was in May 2022. So it is prior, but we do have ongoing governance and reviews with them. So Scottish Enterprise, we are very open and frank with them about our current situation that we find ourselves in. So they are fully briefed of what's going on.
Look, thank you very much, and I hope you understand my reasons for wanting just to really probe at the timeline and decision-making process. So thank you.
Okay, I'll bring in the Deputy Convener.
Thank you. Again, just following on a slight question from Daniel, NFI Group published the results of their refinancing plan in July 2023. Did that refinancing, I mean, any normal refinancing plan would look under the covers of all elements of the business. So did that refinancing plan indicate or start to look at the process of the ultimate consolidation as a condition of the refinancing?
No.
Okay. I just wanted to pick up on a point you made, Debbie, in terms of the monies. I think you said 13 million from Scottish Enterprise, and you said, and again, correct me if I'm wrong in that, it's the first time you've reneged on anything. Just a wee question. Mm-hmm. What, if any, remedies are in place for Scottish Enterprise in terms of clawback?
I mean, in terms of, I guess, the clawback clause, it was a risk that we've built into that business plan to say when we were considering the consolidation that they could indeed claw back the full amount. So that is something we've considered financially, is
okay.
that they could arguably say, you've reneged on your commitment. So,
right. So you've baked that in?
We absolutely have. We've baked that in. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to check, in terms of, you've mentioned peripherally engagement with both the UK Government and the Scottish Government. It'd be useful for the committee to hear what engagement that has been. Obviously, there may be some things you can't share, and I appreciate that. So in terms of the UK Government, the Department of Business, they've got a separate section for distressed businesses. Have you had any engagement with them? What has it been? What have they offered? What's the current status? And also with the Scottish Government as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take Scottish Government first, I guess, as that's really the easiest one to start off with. So in terms of when we notified, to be clear for the committee, we made both governments aware on the 23rd of May that we were considering this action. In terms of Scottish Government engagement, the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have been actively engaged with us. And in terms of subsequent follow-up, it's been the Economy Directorate within Scottish Government, Transport Scotland and Scottish Enterprise. At the UK level, the Secretary of State for Scotland has been, I guess, the predominant lead within UK Government. We've had meetings as well with the Department for Transport through the local Transport Minister, and with the Department of Business and Trade, it is the Minister for Industry that we've engaged with. At the moment, we're not in the distressed company. We had asked that question to say, is that something we can consider? But the response that we've seen from both governments has been the creation of it's like a cross-government working group or task force. And to be clear, Alexander Dennis is not a part of the task force, but it's made up of, again, I think it's chaired by Scottish Government, Transport Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, Scotland Office, Cabinet Office, Department for Business and Trade and the Department for Transport are all part of that group. And the brief is to see, is there a way to bridge it? So I don't know if that is instead of the distressed company, as I believe there's certain metrics within the Treasury Department. But I'm not quite sure. We've not quite got to whether we fit that right now. But I would say the engagement's been really encouraging. They're really keen to help. But at the moment, it's just trying to see what can we do within this consultation period. So I would say there's been great engagement from both sides. Okay. And obviously we welcome, commitments from combined authorities to reconsider, their own timelines as well. So in terms of support, it's been fantastic, but we are, the scale of the challenge is quite large for us, and the asks that we have outlined to the committee today, we're under no illusion, they are big asks, so it is something that they're actively considering.
And in terms of, I mean, we've heard various kind of options on the table. You would have heard the unions talk yesterday about the potential for a shorter term furlough scheme. Have you gamed various scenarios as to what commitments you would give in return? I appreciate that there could be a variety of scenarios, but what I'm trying to explore with you is the extent to which you thought, right, well, if we are going to get X, we will give something back. And therefore, can you give me a flavour of what scenarios you potentially gamed?
I think in terms of the scenarios, it's, if that orders scenario was to come through, the expectation that we have been, I guess, working on is that the orders would be built in Scotland. That we've taken as a given would be part of the expectation. So that is something that we would be completely accepting of. Within the furlough scheme, it is a really complex, and I should say the solution has to be both for it to come through for us. But the furlough scheme is proving quite complex, getting into the detail of how it works, where are the legal risks and challenges within it. But again, it's something that we're fully committed to exploring and sort of seeing what are the type of risks that the company would take on versus Scottish Government, and as it's quite a special situation. But it is something that we are absolutely committed to working through, and we've been, in terms of the data, we've been sharing things like payroll and what would the actual figures be like? Can we afford this type of scheme? So we are fully committed to doing it. But I think the main thing I imagine for the interest of the committee would be the orders themselves is be built in Scotland. Even if they weren't destined for Scotland, the expectation would be built them in the Scottish factories. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It comes down to risk. And that will be as much a consideration for the Scottish Government or the UK Government, because they can't risk giving public funds that then doesn't result in a sustainable business plan. As we were talking about demand earlier. If things were to change, I suppose a question is, could Chassis Building be brought back to Falkirk? Is that a potential option that is being considered and should be considered?
It's going to come back to your previous questions. Well, those conversations are really live as well. So in terms of the discussions on furlough in the last sort of hours, if you like, so regular correspondence on that topic. The most recent consultation meeting was on Tuesday, and of course they are there to try and explore alternatives. That was proposed potentially as an alternative. So we've now taken that, and again we heard the trade union make reference to it yesterday. So we've taken that away now as a sort of a task, as again just as a normal part of the consultation process to explore whether or not there's some feasibility of doing that. So yes, we will investigate it. Okay, well that's good to hear. If things were to change, I suppose my question to you actually is, how would you define the relationship between unions to management? And what, if any, changes would you want to put in place where a route forward for Falkirk to be found? I think relationships are reasonably good. I was surprised to hear the word frosty get used yesterday. I mean, I have a very good relationship with national officials, and that's really born because some of the challenges that we have in our sector, I think, are also being observed in other parts of automotive. So. We do have, I think, a reasonably good relationship. I would also say, in terms of just as an employer as well, we're the highest paying bus manufacturer, across that serves the UK market. Our voluntary turnover in Scotland is around 1%. We have a very good track record of well-paid, skilled jobs and people that join us and have a career with Alexander Dennis. So, in terms of the sort of trade union relationship and any changes, clearly a level of flexibility would be welcome, because we do. When we talk about building 1,600 buses a year, they don't all come at once. That's a level load factory, and sadly our world doesn't work like that. Back to the member's question on who can move quickly. But I would say, as I say, I was surprised to hear the term frosty being used yesterday, because relations are
Yeah.
I would say are pretty positive. And both unions have been very clear in terms of wanting to work with us and engage with us to get to the right outcome. So when we talk about active engagement politically, it has been also with the trade unions as well.
I don't want to sound rude, but does that not tell you something if the unions came to us yesterday and used that term frosty? As a minimum, it's suggesting something about the manner of engagement which goes beyond simply jobs and the kind of functional stuff that they'll have to do with. So how would you classify your active engagement with? They cited a specific example where they had written to you and they said, well, they didn't get a response at all. So there's clearly something there about, from their perception of being engaged with, rather than perhaps being talked at.
I'm very happy to share my response to the point that was made yesterday. Again, I was somewhat surprised to hear that, and
Okay.
I'm very happy to share with the committee my response to the gentleman who raised the point.
Okay.
It's not how I would characterise it.
Okay, thank you. I'm just checking. I had a wee sort of list of questions. No, I think I'm done. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Can I bring in Jimmy Halcrow-Johnson?
Thanks very much. Just before I get on to kind of the main questions I wanted, just referring back to Daniel Johnson's questions, we talked about the funding through Scottish Enterprise awarded in 2022. Is that correct? Has any been drawn down since February, since the decision was made to consolidate?
I would need to come back to you with our exact accounts, if that's okay. If I could write to the committee to say if anything's been drawn down. If there's been any specific claims since February. But I'm happy to come back to the committee to confirm exactly if anything has been.
Okay, if you could do that. And
Yep.
When you've talked about, and in response to Daniel, I think to Michelle's point about baking this into the decision, how much have you baked in, basically returning the full amount?
Our obligations, yes.
Yeah, okay. And you again, kind of following Daniel Johnson's questions, which was about when you might have considered it. Will you make a profit this year?
No.
Did you make a profit last year?
No, not at net income level, no.
When was the last year you made a profit?
2019.
Okay, so it's a fair few years that you've not made a profit. And consolidation or looking at what assets you've got hasn't been part of considerations at all.
No, but I would answer the same response I gave to the member there. That we have spent the best part of say 8 figures, on retaining skills and capacity. It's not, and that's not just been for the sake of it. We did that with a belief system that the market would come back. I think we're all in agreement that public transport should be a good place to be. Decarbonisation, what's not to be positive about the reality is that the market is not as we expected. So,
well, if I can come on to that, just because the questions I'm going to be asking all about sustainability and how we can produce buses in this country and do it with competition that seems to be only growing. So I just want to kind of got some kind of clarity on that. You talked, I think, earlier about the UK demand for buses. What's the Scottish demand, and what's your market share of that? The annual Scottish demand for buses, on average. I appreciate because it might change. And what's your market share of that?
We might need to come back to you on the details for Scotland. Scotland's obviously much smaller than England, but we'll come back to you on that. I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay. And do you know roughly, and this again may be one you have to come back on, but the kind of of the Scottish demand, what the ratio of private and public sector is to that?
Yeah, we'll come back to you on that.
Okay. All right. If I can kind of start with some of the other questions I had. The union officials we had in yesterday suggested that the kind of, on average, the Chinese models, and I think we were focusing on Chinese models, when compared to the models that you're producing, were around about £100,000 cheaper per unit, I don't know, per bus. Would you recognise that figure?
No.
You wouldn't?
Yeah.
Would you be able to say, or?
Well, we don't know for sure. I mean, those are commercially sensitive, information that we would not have normal access to. I was, again, slightly surprised to hear the figures being quoted, to know that we wouldn't recognise those.
Okay. Of course, yeah.
So for us, we we're not supposed to know. Competition-wise, we are, we as manufacturers shouldn't know what our competitors are pricing. We can, go on feedback, from tenders, for example, if we've maybe lost out or if we've had maybe intel from a customer. But in terms of access to the data on pricing, we don't have that. But our understanding is the likes of Transport Scotland and the Department for Transport, they do have it from, they would have, and again, it would be a sample based on the applications they've had for funding. Because within that, everyone has to quote the prices they've been given for funding.
Of course, if I went to them, or if we went to them, or anybody went to them, they would say it's commercially sensitive anyway, so they wouldn't be able to provide that information.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah, which I mean, I can appreciate that. I mean, would you recognise, without putting any figure on it, then would you recognise, or would you think that they were producing cheaper because of a whole load of the things that we've talked about today, supply chains and labour? But you would imagine that there was a gap there in price.
I think there's probably a distinction that needs to be taken between market price and market cost, because I think that bus operators, the price of the vehicle is important. The reliability, its TCO, what it does, I think is equally important. So I think, do I think that the international competition have what's the way to describe it, sort of a stronger ability? Yes, I do. Because I do think that the market cost is significantly different for some of the reasons I outlined earlier.
Yeah, I recognise that. And if there is that gap there, is it widening?
Well, I think from our standpoint, that there are different factors at play. Battery pricing, as a function almost of raw material movements. Our inputs, and from a cost standpoint, obviously go up every year with inflation. And I have to say here, a business of our size and a bill of £2 million of national insurance contributions this year is significant for us. Yeah. That's not insignificant for us as well. So, it potentially could widen.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. This is why we're kind of keen to have that discussion on the level playing field and local content recognition, because if there is something that does recognise that we maybe do have those higher input costs, it could, or if there's some way to weight it within tenders, it kind of levels things off a wee bit. And I guess to give a bit more context of why we keep coming back to local content for us, NFI Group has been mentioned, and they are a North American business, but where our sister companies within NFI Group operate, it is predominantly America and Canada. And within America, you've got the Buy America scheme, which is 70% of any bus has to be American. So the only way you can do that is build it and have the people there in America building the buses. In Canada, some of the provinces do 25% Canadian content rules. So again, there's a requirement to level the playing field there. So for us, and I think also when we were explaining to NFI Group to say this is the challenge in the UK, you don't have these ways to sort of, your costs remain the same in the UK, but there's no way to say things could be easier in terms of creating that level playing field.
I think that's helpful. I mean, I think we all accept that China can, across a number of different sectors, can mass produce a lot more efficiently, effectively than we can. But you do win orders from UK bus companies. And I think what they were talking about, I think it was Blackpool, there was an order, is that right?
It's a prospect. I think they also be the companies that were mentioned yesterday, they are all just prospects.
All right. Okay. So, but when you do win contracts, because you obviously are winning contracts from orders from other transport companies, what are you winning it on, I suppose? Because that essentially is, obviously so important. You are winning those deals. So why are they choosing you over what we probably accept as a cheaper alternative from abroad?
I think I'd come back to before you come in. I think for the Scottish Enterprise grant funding is what's been able to help us create these technology and innovation leading products. So the buses that we have designed for the UK market, they stack up against its competitors. They are super efficient. They have good range on them. We've done a lot of engineering to make sure that they can do the job for operators in terms of what it is they require. And we've got things like we do route modelling with them to see what does your kind of bus do you actually need. So we've done, I'd say, some very specific tailoring work with operators to say, here is the bus that we've designed, but here's what we think would be best meet your requirements. So in terms of being able to win, we have, as I've outlined in terms of the financial sort of contributions that have gone into these products, like we have made the investments and we have created, Scottish engineered buses that can indeed win contracts.
So and they're winning them on product rather than anything else, on subsidy or etc. It is because they are choosing your product over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could I just add a comment to that? I think there's a whole number of reasons I would suggest. The UK, so the low emission sector, not the zero emission sector. The low emission sector is less competitive because nobody's innovating low emission buses anymore. So that sector is much less open to disruption. And the UK, in terms of capacity, it's not limitless in terms of who can supply. UK also has some unique requirements. Our sort of infamous Roman roads and midi buses and things like that. So we do have a highly customised, highly tailored offering for the UK market. So sometimes so size and shape of the bus is important. And then some operators from a fleet commonality standpoint having just similar components and parts and stuff, and of course relationships too. So I think there's a whole number of explanations.
Okay, great. That's sorry, I've still got a few more things I just want to ask. In terms of the your supply chain and components for buses, how much is currently coming from China? I mean, do you import a significant amount?
Well, I think we have to use the global supply chain. The UK doesn't make axles anymore. It doesn't make transmissions anymore. Those industries were lost many decades ago. So we have to use the global supply chain. I don't have that number off the top of my head. I do know that there's a significant percentage comes from sort of the UK and Europe. So I don't know if we've got that in our documents here.
In terms of our UK supply chain, we've got about 1,000 suppliers. We spent about £1 billion with them in the past 10 years. Scottish suppliers specifically, and this is based off economic impact analysis we did with Scottish Enterprise and PwC. So in terms of jobs, the Alexander Dennis supply chain supports within Scotland, it's 370. In terms of things like income tax and national insurance, the GVA combined from our supply chain alone is 28.3 million for Scotland. Alexander Dennis is 26.2 million on its own. And in terms of that sort of wider employee spending that we would add into these types of calculations, it's about 8.1 billion to the Scottish economy. So in total, through Alexander Dennis, our supply chain, and I guess our employees being part of communities in Scotland, we're looking at 63 million in terms of GVA contributions to the Scottish economy alone.
Okay. I think you mentioned the Scarborough capacity was about 1,200 buses, roughly a year. So that essentially is capping the potential of the company to produce any more of that.
Without recruitment or shift working.
Without recruitment or shift working. So if the facility itself, you could increase production at that site if you wanted, if you were able to, if the demand was there. At 1,200, that's a sustainable model for you.
So back to your question on profitability, again, the business review we've undertaken is how do we become a profitable, sustainable business? At what level would that need to be and how would we do it? And that was ultimately the exam question that then led us to the sort of outcome here.
And were other models considered? For example, if you're already importing, I'm not advocating for this, by the way, but I'm just asking the kind of devil's advocate questions, I suppose. But, assembly, importing parts and assembling in this country, because that's obviously where some other businesses have gone.
We already do a level of that. So,
right.
For example, our new small bus that we brought to market in answer to a call from the market, the sort of steel fabrication element of that is done in China. As I said earlier on, I spent 20 years over there. We used to build buses in Hong Kong. We moved that into China to help our Asia Pacific market. So it's not something we're unfamiliar with. There are other issues there around shipping costs, around shipping delays, and we've lived through the challenges of blockages and things like that. So having that extended supply chain isn't easy. On paper, it sounds like a good idea, but it's quite challenging to execute.
I suppose where I'm kind of looking at this and some of the other questions is the model of actually reducing capacity and making fewer buses and being able to compete on certain contracts when perhaps your competitors in other countries are mass producing or producing at a far higher rate. and therefore able to take some of those hits, whether that's sustainable.
Well, I think that brings us back to the crux of some of our ask over the last few years around, what is the value of doing things in the UK generally,
Yeah,
and
without the government intervention.
Well, that is the crux of it, really.
I would just also add, in terms of I guess we would call the split build strategy we've got between some overseas manufacturing. If things did change in the UK and there was more of a requirement to be here, that is absolutely something we would consider bringing back to the UK.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Can I bring in Kevin Stewart?
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning. I want to look, first of all, at the Scottish Enterprise funding. There's a debate about what the figure is, but around about £30.5 million over the last 10 years or so. And I think earlier, Mr Davis, you said that there had been no equivalent funding south of the border from any agencies there. Is that correct?
Correct.
And during your testimony earlier, Ms McCreath, you said that a lot of the product development was thanks to that Scottish Enterprise funding. Would that be right?
Yeah, in part for sure. So it wasn't just Scottish Enterprise. It was also a large amount of investment from the company as well. But, yes.
But a huge amount from public funds here in Scotland.
Yep.
No equivalent monies south of the border to help Alexander Dennis with that product development.
That's correct, with the exception of the Connected Autonomous Vehicle, which is a UK government and Scottish government joint initiative, which is to create the UK's autonomous bus, but that is a small scale.
Very small scale.
Yeah.
But in terms of that R&D money, Scottish money, how much of that product development monies, that R&D money, has now led to a new product being manufactured at Scarborough?
All the products that are manufactured at Scarborough will have been supported through that grant. So particularly those new electric buses we were talking about, and in previous grant funding from Scottish Enterprise, there was support towards creating, smart pack, smarter low emission buses as well. So it's fair to say that every product with Alexander Dennis has in some way or form been supported by Scottish Enterprise over the last 5-10 years.
So some folk would say or think it's kind of ironic that Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Government money has gone in to help you guys with R&D and product development, and now you're moving manufacture to a site south of the border where you have had no R&D money, no help in terms of product development. Do you see the irony in that?
I would acknowledge the irony for sure, but I think in terms of, from our side, we're having to make, the consultation, the decisions that have led to the consultation to be financially sustainable for the future. And I guess from our side, I would make the point that it's fantastic that we have had this level of support and we are incredibly grateful for it. But in terms of the market that these products are then going into in the UK, it is really challenging for us to be able to compete. But
can you see why folk would think it's grand you saying that it's fantastic that we've had that level of support as a company, and at the same time the company is saying to its workforce in Scotland and those that have helped fund you in Scotland, stuff you, we're moving all of our manufacturing south of the border? Could you understand that feeling?
I can absolutely understand the feeling for sure, but I would also, like to restate the fact that this is not, if required, we will pay that grant back. Like, it's not like we're moving and not paying it back. So it is, I would just like to clarify that point.
I'm sure we'll find out about the remedies later on. Let me continue on around about the Scarborough site. Again, Mr Davis, you said that you have a long-term lease there. Can I ask how long that lease is and when that long-term lease was entered into, please?
I think it's out to 2033 potentially, so I imagine that's a 10-year lease, so a couple of years ago. I can check and come back to you, but I think that's correct.
I understand that also in Scarborough you have got some warehousing which came into your possession. I don't know if it's lease or what in recent times. Can you tell us around about the decision making of why you decided to enter into that deal, and what kind of what leasing is going on there?
Yeah, again, I can come back on the specifics of the logistics facility, but that decision was taken because we had a rather unfortunate event in Scarborough where a mini tornado tore part of the roof off of our buildings and caused some significant sort of issues and challenges around where we could house materials. We had 9 temporary tents on site, and the adoption of the off-site kitting and logistics warehouse was in some ways to assist the recovery from that unfortunate event.
Okay. You said earlier on that the decisions around about this to move production to Scarborough, where you have a leased plant, has nothing to do with asset liquidation of the plants that you own in Scotland.
Correct.
Okay. In terms of your decision to stick with a long-term lease site and to get rid, possibly, of your sites in Scotland, what would that do to the balance sheet?
Well, first of all, we're not getting rid of both of our sites in Scotland. So just to be clear, in Larbert, we are suspending production in Larbert. We're not intending to do anything else with that site, although per the question from the Deputy Convener around, is there other options there around chassis manufacturing? That's a topic that we're taking away. The Falkirk site, as you heard from the union members yesterday, is a site that we have been on a journey to extract ourselves from, hence the investment in the Larbert facility.
Okay. You've said earlier on as well that none of the decisions here have got to do with NFI Group refinancing. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you said earlier on the decisions around about Larbert and Camelin were reached in February of this year. Is that right?
That's correct.
Would you be willing to provide the committee with the timelines and the decision-making processes of the Alexander Dennis board and also the NFI Group board around about some of these decisions, the ones that were taken in 2019 in terms of refinancing and the timelines in terms of your decision around about Camelin, Larbert versus Scarborough?
Absolutely.
So open book in all of this?
We can show you exactly the timeline and the backdrop to the decision-making process, yes.
Okay. I think that would be useful for the committee and, of course, for both governments as well. I've, as you well know, Mr Davis, been round the Larbert site with your good self. You said earlier on that the decision was taken that should be double-deck production, but you cannot do the entire three-put because there is no paint shop there. Can I ask around about the decision-making, around about why it was that certain parts of production were not added to that site when it was developed?
So we had a phase 1 and a phase 2 approach. Phase 1 was to redevelop the site, and you would not recognise it since your visit. Phase 1 to develop the site, to build the buses to a pre-paint condition, and then move the vehicles to Falkirk for painting and finishing. With a sort of an outline plan, which has been a discussion with the Scottish Enterprise as well around what the opportunities and potentials are to expand the site, to put the painting and finishing capability into it. So it was always going to be a staged approach. And that's why we're sort of, as I say, we're in this point where things have changed, and therefore the phase 2 has never been proposed, has never been signed off, or really expanded and developed, because we're not in a position to do that now.
Okay. I want to turn a little bit to international competition. And you mentioned some of the difficulties that you face. You mentioned the employer's national insurance contributions hike. How much does that cost the company?
On an annualised basis, it's £2 million.
And
the additional element.
Not insignificant number. There was some skipping over some elements of additional costs that you would face compared to competitors earlier. In terms of energy costs for the company, would you say that your energy costs here in the UK, which will be the same in Scarborough as they will be in Falkirk, are probably around about 4 times higher than some of your international competitors?
Correct.
So that's a real difficulty for the company in terms of sustainability. In terms of the international supply chain, battery costs are pretty significant?
Yes, they are. We estimate we're probably paying double for our battery per kilowatt than Chinese manufacturers. Chinese
manufacturers, you've got a huge amount of Chinese lithium to call upon in terms of their manufacture. Do you think that there should be, in terms of a UK industrial strategy, should there be a real delve into how we can overcome some of that, what some folk would say is unfair advantages in competition?
My personal view is yes. I think it needs to be quite well considered, and also carefully considered in the context of, okay, well, how are you going to value local content? We've seen, through British Vote, for example, where perhaps too big too soon and not able to sustain. I heard the reference yesterday made to the Faraday battery project, of which we're a part of, to explore opportunities to do that type of work in the UK. And we are happily supporting that. We do think there is value there, and I actually think from a bus industry standpoint, given the amount of public money that's going into our sector, doing something on a more boutique level, a smaller scale level like bus would make a lot of sense. But I would, and I said this at the UK bus manufacturing expert panel, I think that has to be really careful, because we can't afford something else that makes us even more uncompetitive. So I agree with the principle. I think it's it's a sensible and logical way forward, but it's got to be carefully considered. Otherwise, it's just perhaps going to make a difficult situation worse. Okay.
In terms of other aspects of the international scenario, are there other areas where there is additional subsidy for other manufacturers elsewhere, or other elements where you cannot be competitive because of the level of subsidy that you'd like to highlight to the committee?
I don't have the specifics. I could only point, as I think I answered earlier on, to the European Commission investigation, and from a European car tariff standpoint, and some of the actions that came out of that. I've not read it in detail. I do know that it did uncover state help, because it then resulted in tariffs being applied, or indeed if you did not furnish the inquiry with that information, then tariffs were applied, sort of just generally. So yeah, I think the battery cost of energy for manufacturing, employment cost, those are the key elements that really make it challenging when you compare Alexander Dennis against a domestic Chinese manufacturer.
Please, Debbie.
Just briefly add, we did contemplate last year an investigation with the Trade Remedies Authority. At the UK level, we did think about is this something we want to take forward in light of the European Commission investigation into automotive? However, we did our sort of investigation process into it and found that the onus is on industry and the legal fees that would have been associated with putting an application together to indeed unearth all these challenges, which we were told you might not even get the information that you're requiring through this, and you may have spent 7 figures on a legal retainer and you've come out of it 18 months later without any form of...
So basically, in terms of getting that investigations, the costs of doing that should be much lower in terms of getting to grips with some of these things as well. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, that would be helpful, particularly for us, as we were in, as the committee is aware, we did do restructuring last year as well. If you are in a challenging financial position as a company, having to find that additional funding for an investigation is really quite tricky.
Sorry, if I could just add, there's another important element to consider there. We were advised that would have to be an industry-wide activity and not something that we did independently.
Sure.
And our primary UK competitor, who we work with, on some levels around conversations on subsidy control and local content, they have links to another manufacturing business and another equipment business that has embarked on that same action and didn't get anything out of it. So therefore, the appetite for them to join us it just does not make sense.
Thank you very much for being here today. I'm sure you understand some of the line of questioning. I think it is immensely frustrating for folk to hear that here in Scotland we have invested in a company where south of the border they haven't, and now you're moving south of the border. But what I really welcome is the fact that you have said here today that for you, Alexander Dennis and the NFI Group, that you'll be completely and utterly open book about some of these decisions that you've taken.
Can I clarify one point I made to you earlier on, if that's okay? The business review we undertook was in February, but we didn't go through a board approval process until later. That was in May. So just a point of
well, I'm sure that will come out in terms of the open book aspect that you have said that you will help with. So thank you very much to both of you.
Can I just... obviously, you've mentioned the working group effectively that's been set up between the UK and Scottish Government. You're not part of that group. Is there anything that you haven't put on record today that's been an ask from the company to the UK and Scottish Government? I think we've touched on issues around, obviously, the Subsidy Act, around orders, effectively. Is there anything that you haven't put on record today that's been effectively a submission from yourself to both governments in terms of your asks?
I think in terms of the consultation, we've captured everything in terms of those two short-term asks between a furlough and a potentially fresh order creation, and then that longer-term, medium to longer-term, looking at local content and subsidy control, or however we can find a solution to it. But one thing that we've, I guess, advocated for at the UK level through our joint group that Paul mentioned, we've got an all-party group down in Westminster that we work with our UK competitor on. And it was something that I think the member Daniel Johnson made comments yesterday, is that we had, in our comprehensive spending review submission to the UK, we had asked for buses to be considered part of the critical national infrastructure. So in terms of being able to protect and safeguard the industry, and seeing it as something that we need to nourish and protect, was something that I think we're quite keen to make the committee aware of. That is something we've asked for previously.
Okay. I suppose the final question, this decision will have a massive social and economic impact, particularly in the Falkirk Lambert area. What is the scale of that impact? We know there are 400 direct jobs that will be lost as a result of this decision. What is the impact around supply chain jobs? I've seen a figure of 1,600 mentioned. Not sure where that came from, but what assessment have you made about what the impact this will have on those communities and in the number of jobs that will be lost in those communities?
So the impact that we've got, and I'm happy to share this with the committee in terms of the economic impact analysis, but on current sort of modelling, the estimation is 370 jobs within a wider supply chain as part of the challenge that we would face. In terms of communities that you ask about, the only ones I can give, I guess, clarity to at this time is those areas within Scotland, of which we have Alexander Dennis people employed at the moment. So the majority of people are Falkirk based. We've then got North Lanarkshire is the next largest area. that we have. So they're the two predominant community regions that we would expect to have the largest impact if the consultation does indeed come to pass.
But based on those figures, obviously a very substantial impact indeed. Okay, I think that brings us to the... Oh, sorry, apologies to Daniel Johnson. A final supplementary from Daniel,
Yeah,
sorry.
just a couple of clarification points, really, and just sort of weaving together the analysis and some of the numbers that have been put together. Just for clarity, so obviously clear about the total capacity, so it's 1,600, 400 in Scotland. You're saying you needed an additional order book of, or additional number of orders of around 300 on an ongoing basis, which what would take the total output to what? Would that be about 1,400 across all sites to keep the Scottish sites open as well? Would that be roughly right?
Yeah, so Scarborough capacity is about 1,200, but as I said earlier on, that's assuming a level load and everything comes at the right time. So
but a total order book of what, approximately 1,400?
Yeah, 1,400, 1,500, something like that. Yeah.
And can I ask, when was the last time you had an annual output of 1,400?
Well, 2020, last year.
Last year?
Yeah, last year we delivered 1,400 buses to the market in 2024.
And just in terms of the split, so that would imply that you've got about a quarter of your capacity in Scotland, 3/4 of your capacity in Scarborough. And just going back through sorry, is that roughly?
Yeah, but I know,
I know it's on different product lines.
No, it's not the product line, but it makes it more complex because throughout all of these recent years, we have carried a level of non-productive time. Yeah, we've not been making buses. We've been retaining skill deliberately.
Yeah, it's capacity. I get that rather than throughput. Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, so just going, back to the investment pre sort of the various stages of investment. I mean, has that split always been the case, or has there been a tilt towards Scarborough in terms of that balance of capacity? I mean,
I don't think it will have changed much, but I'm happy to go back in time and give you the split in terms of volumes that have come from both.
Especially
both
pre the £8 million investment. It was I've forgotten what the figure was. The investment in Scarborough. But what did that do in terms of the split between capacity between Scarborough and Scotland?
I don't think it's made a massive impact. Okay. It's negligible.
Great. That was all I wanted to clarify. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much indeed to both yourselves for taking the time to come out to the committee this morning. That brings us to the end of the evidence session, and I'll suspend the meeting and move into private session.